joined today on Civilnet by Varant Meguerditchian, Executive Director of ANC Australia. Thank you so much for being with us today. For us, it's good morning. For you, it's good evening. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you, Greg?
Very good. We're speaking to you today because in November, quite a historic and maybe milestone type event happened for Australia in terms of getting 7 different MPs to speak on the parliament floor about the importance of recognition of genocides, which of course included the Armenian Genocide. From there, I'd love if you could fill us in as to what's going on right now and what happened during that process.
Well, earlier we had 7 members of the Australian Parliament speak about the Armenian Genocide, and they did that off the back of a visit by a joint delegation of the Armenian National Committee of Australia, the Australian Hellenic Council, and the Assyrian Universal Alliance, who led a campaign to visit the Parliament of Canberra, the Federal Parliament of Australia, to seek formal recognition by the Government of Australia for the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocides. And this campaign started in earnest about 2008, but has been progressively building in momentum. And as you mentioned earlier, we had 7 members of Parliament speak about the genocide. And moreover, quite significantly, they were across the political spectrum. So we had members of the opposition, the minority parties, as well as the government.
In that process of convincing people, which started earlier in the month, what backlash did you hear and how difficult was it to get people towards your side, if you will?
Oh, look, most of the obstacles that we face are similar to those that are faced by the ANCA in the United States, and prior to Canada recognising it would have been faced by the ANC Canada, of course. They include the relationship between, for instance, in our case, the relationship between Australia and Turkey, the fact that Turkey is a geopolitical power, it has significance in the region, and that it would be offensive to Turkey if our government was to recognise the Armenian Genocide. Of course, we're working on an issue of humanity here, though, and we know that if Australia is going to be a champion in human rights, then it must, of course, recognise the Armenian Genocide. And often we tell members of Parliament that in doing so, they're not going to be the champion of human rights, because they're in fact going to be the 21st nation to recognise the Armenian Genocide, not the first. I think it's worthwhile giving a bit of a background here. The New South Wales Parliament, New South Wales is the largest state in Australia. The New South Wales Parliament passed the resolution on the Armenian Genocide in 1997. Since then, only one other state has passed a resolution or a motion recognising the Armenian Genocide. That, in fact, was the state of South Australia. And when South Australia recognised the Armenian Genocide, they in fact also recognised the Greek and Assyrian genocides. Now, 2009, that resolution passed, and it was passed 1 year before the Swedish Parliament acknowledged the history of the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocide. So we actually have the first legislative body in the world here in Australia to have recognised the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocides. Now, why is this important? Well, apart from this being an issue of humanity, where of course we want Australia to be a champion for recognising crimes against humanity, we have also the fact that there are 50,000 Armenian Australians, there are 50,000 Assyrian Australians, and approximately 800,000 Greek Australians. So essentially there are 900,000 Australians of Armenian, Greek or Assyrian heritage who in some way have been impacted by the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocide. So this is a sizable portion of the Australian public for whom recognition is significantly important.
What's the next step towards actually getting to the point where Australia, as you said, becomes the 21st nation to recognize these genocides?
Well, it was an issue of education, firstly, because when we first started our concerted efforts in 2007, 2008, we hadn't had a single member of Parliament speak about the Armenian Genocide. But more than this, we needed to explain to them where Armenia was. So now the next step from here is to continue to have more and more people speak about the Armenian Genocide to the point where it becomes less and less taboo, and there are less and less objections to it. Once we're in a position where we have a growing support amongst the opposition and majority parties, then we'd be looking at passing a motion for the recognition of the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocides. I'm confident that we'd be looking at doing that in the coming years.
Sure, sometime in 2012. I think now is a good time to explain kind of the setup of Australian government and what the supreme significance of the two majority party members speaking was for the cause.
Absolutely. It is quite significant to have a member of the government speak about the Armenian genocide. Now, we've had in the past members of the opposition parties and minority parties call for recognition by the government. But in Australia, the party system is such that you have a lot of party discipline. So unlike the US system, we have members of the party will not break away from party policy. Now, of course, all of you would be aware that the Australian government's policy on the issue of the Armenian genocide is one of avoidance. It doesn't characterize the events of 1915 as genocide. To have two members of the government break away from party policy and call for recognition of the Armenian genocide is a significant milestone. What it basically represents is that we have members of parliament who are prepared to move away from the party's position and take a position of morality and call for recognition of the Armenian genocide. Specifically in Australia, what's important is the fact that the House of Representatives, which is the house in which the majority party must have the greatest number of members to hold government, in the House of Representatives in Australia, the Labor Party only holds government by two members of Parliament. And so to have two members of government break away, we would only require the support then of opposition and minority parties to have a motion passed through the Parliament.
One of the trends seems to be, and one of my personal fears is that it's not that these measures necessarily get defeated, but rather politicians say, it's not a top priority. They push it aside, push it aside, push it aside. I just wonder if you have the momentum right now, or if you feel you have the momentum right now to get past those common forms of politics that prevent something like this from getting passed.
I guess it's an issue that's quite old now already. It's an issue that happened, I guess, started in 1915. However, what's important to remember is that there are consequences to the Armenian genocide. I mean, Armenia, the landmass of Armenia now is landlocked as a result of the Armenian genocide. Furthermore, it's actually got an economic blockade by the successive government to the perpetrator. And so there are present-day implications of this crime against humanity. I mean, that's specifically in relation to Armenia. Moreover, we've seen after the Armenian genocide, we've seen genocide happening in Europe, we've seen it in Cambodia, Rwanda, we're seeing it happening in Darfur today. So if you're a government across the world, and if you claim to be one that is going to be a leader amongst other nations, you must take a moral stance on this. And we continue to push this concept to the members of parliament. And look, many of them have been receptive. As I mentioned to you before, we had very few speakers on this issue, and there's been a growing number in the coming year. And of course, as you mentioned, the momentum is now with us, and we must continue that in order to get a motion through the parliament here in Australia.
Thank you so much. Varant Meguerditchian, thank you so much for joining us, Executive Director of ANC Australia. Let's hope in the coming months we have another conversation where either you're telling me that there's a resolution on the floor, or maybe even better, that there's a resolution passed and Australia does become the 21st country, as you mentioned. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gret. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.